All right, diving into cognitive therapies, huh? This textbook chapter you sent, super interesting. Looks like we're going deep on how these therapies actually work, like the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, exactly. We're going way beyond just defining what they are. We're looking at where they came from, the core ideas, and how they're used to help people with, well, our sorts of challenges.
Awesome. And the chapter zeroes in on two big names in the field, right? Albert Ellis and Beck.
That's right. Both of them, they started as psychoanalysts but got kind of disillusioned with how effective it was. They felt like it was too passive, stuck in the past. They wanted something more active, focused on the present, and really emphasizing the power of thoughts.
It's wild. They both come from that same background, but ended up with their own unique approaches. There's that story about Ellis, really shows his personality, apparently, to deal with social anxiety. He made himself talk to 130 women in the park.
Yeah, he was a bit of a character, for sure, but it's more than just a funny story, right? It shows that Ellis really believed you could tackle irrational beliefs and fears by just confronting them head on.
He walked the walk, putting himself out there. That takes guts. So REBT, Rational-Emotive Behavior Therapy, that's Ellis's big thing. He thought a lot of our emotional distress comes from irrational beliefs we have about stuff that happens.
Yeah, he had a way with words calling it masturbatory thinking, getting stuck in these rigid musts and shoulds, like thinking, I must be successful to be happy. That just sets you up for disappointment constantly.
He did not hold back. So REBT helps you see that while you might prefer certain outcomes, they're not make or break for your well-being.
Exactly. You challenge those demands, swap them for more flexible beliefs. It's more like, I'd prefer to be successful, but even if I'm not, I can still find happiness in other ways.
Real mindset shift, moving away from black and white thinking. Now, Beck and his cognitive therapy, the chapter talks about maladaptive cognitions, which sounds kind of technical.
It sounds fancy, but it's really about recognizing those negative thought patterns or distortions that feed into our problems. Imagine it like a filter in your mind that colors how you see yourself and the world.
So like, if I'm constantly telling myself, I'm a failure, that would be a maladaptive cognition.
Spot on. And Beck's style, it's less about attacking those thoughts directly. It's more like a collaboration, exploring them together. He uses this Socratic dialogue, asking questions to guide the client towards recognizing and challenging their own negativity.
So less confrontational than Ellis's REBT, more of a gentle nudge.
Think of it like a detective and client working together, looking at the evidence and challenging those faulty assumptions. Like in the chapter, there's that example of the student who was so depressed, convinced she wouldn't get into any PhD programs. Turns out, through carefully examining her thoughts and her actual qualifications, she realized her thinking was way too catastrophic.
It's scary how easily our thoughts can go haywire. So what are the main tools both REP and cognitive therapy use to help people change those negative patterns?
Well, one they both use is cognitive restructuring. You identify those unhelpful thoughts and actively work on replacing them with more balanced and realistic ones.
So it's not just becoming aware of them, it's about consciously shifting them.
Right. Another one is behavioral experiments where you actually test those beliefs out in real life. For example, if you're convinced public speaking is always going to be terrifying, you might try joining a Toastmasters group to see if that prediction actually holds up.
Putting it to the test. And the chapter mentions activity scheduling too.
Yep. That's all about intentionally engaging in enjoyable activities to boost your mood and challenge those negative thought patterns. Being proactive about feeling better, not just waiting for it to happen.
So like if you're feeling down, instead of stewing in it, you schedule a coffee date with a friend or go for a walk in nature.
Exactly. And these are things that can be helpful even outside of therapy. And the great thing is there's actually a ton of research to back up how effective they are.
Music to my ears. So theory is all well and good, but do these therapies actually work in practice?
The research is really impressive. Cognitive therapies consistently show positive results for a huge range of problems: depression, anxiety disorders, PTSD, even eating disorders.
Well, that's quite the list. But like with anything, I guess there are criticisms too.
Of course. No therapy is perfect. It's important to look at all sides. Some critics say cognitive therapies put too much focus on thoughts and not enough on things outside the person, like trauma or social injustice.
Yeah, sometimes it's not just about adjusting your thinking, it's about needing the world around you to change. And I imagine some folks might find that whole rationality thing a bit off-putting.
You've hit on another common critique. That focus on rationality might not resonate with everyone, especially folks from different cultures where there are other ways of knowing and coping that are more important.
Right, so it's a reminder that one size doesn't fit all. Cultural sensitivity is huge. Now, the chapter uses a case study to show how these therapies work in real life, right? A woman, Mrs. C, who develops severe OCD after her daughter gets pinworms.
Fascinating case. Shows how even something seemingly small can trigger serious distress, especially when combined with existing vulnerabilities. For Mrs. C, her daughter's illness set off her perfectionistic beliefs, that need for control, leading to all those compulsive washing rituals.
Sounds really tough. How did cognitive therapy help in that situation?
It helped her unpack those absolute beliefs, those musts and shoulds that were fueling the anxiety. Thoughts like, pinworms are terrible, I'm a horrible mother. Therapy helped her challenge those thoughts, replace them with more balanced perspectives.
So instead of seeing those pinworms as this huge defining event, she was able to have a more nuanced, realistic view.
Yeah, and it's important to note that OCD often responds well to cognitive and behavioral techniques. Learning to manage her anxiety, challenge those distorted thoughts, Mrs. C was able to get back a sense of control and normalcy in her life.
Inspiring to see that even ingrained patterns can change with the right support. But I'm curious about the bigger implications of this case.
Well, one big takeaway is that our thoughts can have a huge impact on our emotions and behavior, even when those thoughts are irrational or distorted. And by learning to identify and challenge those unhelpful patterns, we can create more positive experiences for ourselves.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
You said it. We've covered a lot, but there's so much more to explore. Haven't even touched on the future of cognitive therapies, those new third-wave approaches.
I'm hooked already.
Well then, let's dive back in. You know, Mrs. C's case, it really brings to light the heart of both Ellis's REBT and Beck's cognitive therapy. They had different styles, sure, but both wanted to help people overcome distress by, well, changing how they think.
Right, but how does that actually look in practice? Curious about the specific techniques and strategies they use.
Well, REBT, it really goes after those deep-seated irrational beliefs that Ellis saw as the root of emotional problems, you know, like that need to be loved by everyone or believing you just can't stand certain inconveniences.
Those beliefs that can make you feel kind of trapped or super self-critical.
Exactly. REBT helps you challenge those rigid demands, trade them in for more flexible, preferential beliefs. It's about seeing that while you might want certain things, they're not essential for your happiness or your worth as a person.
So instead of, I must be loved by everyone, it's more like, I'd like to be liked, sure, but even if I'm not, I can still be okay with myself and find value in other relationships.
Perfect example. And unlike Ellis, who could be pretty confrontational, Beck's cognitive therapy takes a more collaborative approach. It focuses on those automatic thoughts that kind of fuel negative emotions.
Those knee-jerk reactions we have that honestly aren't even always accurate.
Exactly. Beck uses this gentler, more Socratic way of talking, asking questions to help people examine and challenge those thoughts, come up with other ways of seeing things. It's about empowering them to become aware of their own thinking and discover new ways of thinking on their own.
Like a detective working with a client to find the clues and solve the mystery of their negative thinking.
I like that. Both REBT and cognitive therapy also really stress those homework assignments. They see therapy as a learning process, you know, where the client's actively involved in changing themselves.
Makes sense. Talking about changing your thoughts is one thing, but putting it into practice in your daily life, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Totally. It's about taking that learning outside of the therapy room. Homework might include things like keeping track of those automatic thoughts, trying out new behaviors in tough situations, or even just doing activities that make you feel good and challenge those negative beliefs.
So testing those cognitive skills out in the real world, seeing what happens, and the chapter talks about how these therapies are used for specific issues like anxiety, depression, OCD.
Right. With anxiety, both REBT and cognitive therapy, they help people identify and really look at those catastrophic thoughts that feed the worry.
Instead of getting carried away by all those what-ifs, they learn to stop and ask themselves, is this worry realistic? What evidence do I have? What's the absolute worst that could happen, and could I handle it?
Exactly. Putting those worries in perspective, finding more balanced ways to think about potential threats. And with depression, the focus is on those negative thought patterns that make you feel hopeless, worthless.
So not getting stuck in the self-criticism, the despair, learning to challenge those interpretations and focus on strengths and accomplishments instead.
Right. And with OCD, like we saw with Mrs. C, Cognitive therapy helps unpack those rigid beliefs and rules that drive the compulsions. It's realizing that just because something is undesirable, it doesn't have to control your life.
Good reminder that even really ingrained patterns can shift with the right help and tools. But all this theory is great. Do we actually have proof that these therapies work?
Absolutely. Cognitive therapies have a really strong research base. They're some of the most studied approaches out there.
Okay, hit me with the facts. What does the research actually say?
Study after study shows they're super effective for a whole bunch of conditions: depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, even eating disorders, chronic pain.
Wow, okay, so they work in the lab, but do those results hold up in the real world?
The million-dollar question, right? And the good news is, yeah, the findings from those controlled studies, they generally do apply well to real-life clinical practice.
So it's not just about these therapies working in some perfect scenario. They can actually make a difference for people who are struggling.
Absolutely. And the research also shows something else that's important. The benefits of cognitive therapies tend to stick around. It's not just a temporary fix. They give people tools and skills to manage their thoughts, emotions, behavior, even after therapy ends.
So it's kind of like empowering people to become their own therapists.
Great way to put it. It's giving them a framework to understand how their thoughts influence everything else, and then the skills to change those negative patterns and create more positive ways of being.
It's amazing the impact Ellis and Beck had on therapy, shifting that focus to the power of thoughts.
Total game changers. And their influence is still growing. We're seeing new ways to apply these therapies popping up all the time. Like, there's a lot of interest now in mindfulness-based cognitive therapies.
Oh yeah, I've heard of those. They combine the cognitive techniques with stuff like meditation and acceptance, right?
Exactly. And adding in that mindfulness piece has shown a lot of promise for a range of things, from anxiety and depression to chronic pain and even addiction.
Taking the best of both worlds, the cognitive restructuring from REBT and cognitive therapy, and the present moment awareness, acceptance for mindfulness.
It's about realizing you don't have to believe every thought that pops up and learning to relate to your thoughts and emotions in a more balanced and kind way.
Sounds like a powerful combo. But even with all this evidence, I'm sure there are still some criticisms, challenges around cognitive therapies.
Oh, of course. No approach is perfect. Some people argue that it can be too focused on thoughts and not enough on emotions, relationships, or bigger social and cultural factors.
Sometimes it's not all in our heads, right? Our environments, relationships, even systemic issues can play a huge role in how we feel.
You got it. And some also say cognitive therapies are too much about problem solving, fixing symptoms, and maybe miss out on those bigger goals of personal growth and meaning. Life's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about exploring your values, your purpose, living a life that feels, more rich and fulfilling.
It's that balance then, dealing with the problems that brought someone to therapy, but also making space for those bigger questions.
Exactly. It's seeing therapy as a journey of self-discovery, not just a quick fix.
It's amazing how Ellis and Beck kind of set the stage for a whole new way of thinking about therapy. But I'm curious, what do other approaches have to say about all this emphasis on cognitive restructuring? I imagine there are some different viewpoints out there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's been pushback from a lot of different perspectives. Behavioral, psychoanalytic, humanistic, cultural. They've all raised some important points about cognitive therapies.
Let's break that down a bit. What are some of the big criticisms from those different angles?
Well, one of the main concerns is that cognitive therapies can get too focused on what's going on in the individual's head and kind of miss the impact of stuff happening outside of them. Things like, social injustice, systemic inequalities, past traumas. Those are really powerful forces that shape people's experiences.
Right. It's like telling someone to just think positive when they're up against some huge systemic problem. Doesn't really address the whole picture.
Exactly. Another critique is that this whole focus on rationality can neglect the importance of emotions, intuition. Humans are complex, Reducing our experiences to just pure logic can feel kind of, sterile, not very genuine.
We're not robots. Emotions are a huge part of how we experience things. And sometimes those feelings need to be explored, processed, not just analyzed and restructured.
Great point. And from a cultural perspective, some argue that the whole idea of what's rational can be biased. What's considered rational in one culture might be totally different in another. Imposing one standard on everyone can lead to misunderstandings, even harm.
It's a good reminder that therapy needs to be sensitive to different cultures, adaptable, recognizing all the different ways people experience and deal with challenges. Anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, some folks worry that cognitive therapies, because they're so focused on problem solving, reducing symptoms, they might miss those bigger goals of personal growth, finding meaning. Life isn't just about fixing what's broken, right? It's also about exploring values, purpose, creating a life that feels, well, rich and fulfilling.
So it's about that balance, addressing the immediate problems, the stuff that brings people to therapy, but also holding space for those bigger existential questions.
Exactly. Recognizing that therapy can be this journey of self-discovery, not just a band-aid.
It seems like these criticisms offer some really valuable perspectives. Reminds us that no approach is perfect, and it's super important to use these therapies thoughtfully, responsibly.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about remembering that cognitive therapies are tools. And like any tool, they can be used well or they can be misused. It's up to the therapist and the client working together to find the best approach for that person's needs and goals.
Now, thinking about all of that, what's next for cognitive therapies? The chapter hinted at some cool new stuff on the horizon.
Oh yeah, the field is always changing. It's really exciting. There's a lot of interest now in blending cognitive therapies with other approaches like mindfulness, acceptance, compassion. These newer therapies, they're sometimes called third wave therapies, and they're getting a lot of attention.
I've been hearing more and more about those third wave approaches. What's driving that popularity? What's different about them compared to the more traditional cognitive therapies?
Well, they take the foundation of cognitive therapies, but add in those elements of mindfulness, acceptance, like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, that encourages people to just notice their thoughts and feelings without judgment and focus on living in line with their values.
So not about fighting those tough thoughts and emotions, but making space for them while still going after what's important.
Exactly. And then there's dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, that's really helpful for folks who struggle with like really intense emotions, self-destructive behaviors. It's all about building skills to regulate emotions, handle distress, and have better relationships.
It sounds like these third wave therapies have a more holistic view, recognizing that our minds and bodies are connected and that our relationships are a big part of our mental health.
I like that. They offer a whole toolkit for creating a richer, more meaningful, more balanced life. It's really inspiring to see how the field's growing and changing to meet the needs of people who are looking for support.
So bringing it back to you, our listener, we've really dug into the core ideas of cognitive therapies, the research that shows they work, the criticisms, and the exciting new directions things are headed in. These therapies give you a powerful way to understand how your thoughts shape your experiences, and they give you practical tools to change those negative patterns, create more positive ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving.
Well put. And remember, it's not just about fixing problems. It's about building self-awareness, compassion, a deeper understanding of your own journey. As you explore this stuff more, keep asking questions, stay curious, and trust your own inner wisdom.
I love that. And even if you don't go to formal therapy, those core principles we talked about today can be so helpful. Challenge those assumptions, test out your beliefs, practice being kind to yourself, and stay open to new perspectives.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into cognitive therapies.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.